Hello, everybody. I was doing my Bible study and I was reading the Ignatius Bible study guide for Matthew, and I found this part very interesting, and I wanted to read it to you. It's about 7 minutes long, but it basically tells the authenticity of the findings of the book of Matthew. So I wanted to read that to you. I hope you find it interesting too. Is Matthew's infancy narrative historical? The historical trustworthiness of the Christian gospel is an important issue for the Church. Vatican II restated in 1965 the Church's enduring conviction. The New Testament Gospels faithfully transmit the historical truth about Jesus, his teaching, and his mighty works. De Verbum 19. Nevertheless, scholars sometimes question whether the Gospel writers intended to record history at all. Some claim that Matthew's infancy narrative, chapters 1 through 2, is a prime example of this. Matthew, it is said, did not recount the events of Jesus' birth in the strict sense. He instead composed a midrash on the Old Testament. The word midrash is a Hebrew noun meaning interpretation or commentary. The term has various meanings today. Sometimes it denotes ancient Jewish writings, common after AD 200, that use Old Testament stories to teach religious truths. It can also describe the methods of Old Testament interpretation found in these writings. Most notably, midrash is notorious for retelling biblical stories and embellishing them with fictional details. One midrash on the birth of Moses imaginatively expands the story found in Exodus 2, describing how Moses' father had a dream predicting his birth. An Egyptian scribe informed Pharaoh of his birth, and the scribe himself later sought to kill young Moses. These details add color to Moses' early years, but no such detail is found in the Bible. Matthew 1 through 2 is thought to fit into a similar category of pious reflection. The evangelist is thus charged with fabricating events related to the Old Testament passages, but having no real basis in history. A response to this claim may be outlined in several points. 1. Matthew 1 through 2 is stylistically different from midrash. Unlike midrash, the evangelist's story of Jesus is not founded on an Old Testament text. Whereas midrash seeks to mine deeper meaning of the Old Testament, Matthew does not seek to interpret the Old Testament for its own sake. More to the point, Matthew is not retelling Old Testament episodes, but is telling an entirely new story. It is a story with new characters and events. It's a story that could stand on its own apart from his Old Testament citations. Matthew employs the Old Testament to illuminate the significance of Jesus' birth, not to determine in advance its plot or outcome. Matthew sees Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament promises. He draws from scriptures to support Jesus' qualifications as Israel's Messiah, by linking important episodes, virginal conception, flight to Egypt, massacre of the innocents, etc., with ancient oracles. Unless these events are anchored in history in the first place, it seems unlikely that Matthew would fabricate stories as if Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament. Scripture was never really fulfilled if the events Matthew narrates never happened. In this case, Matthew's exegesis of the Old Testament would amount to little more than an exercise in self-delusion. Besides, were it Matthew's tendency to invent stories out of Old Testament texts, it is likely his narrative would have turned out differently. For example, Psalm 72 verse 10 and Isaiah 60 verses 3 through 6 clearly stand behind Matthew's story of the wise men in Matthew 2. Were Matthew writing midrash, these Old Testament verses would probably exert greater control in shaping his story. Jesus would then receive only 2 gifts, gold and frankincense instead of the three, and kings instead of Persian astrologers would pay him homage. Matthew does not regard the Old Testament as a simple pre-written script of Jesus' life. With the exception of Michael, verse 5, verse 2, Matthew 2, verse 6, Matthew's Old Testament citations appear to be unlikely candidates for messianic prophecies, were he not peering at deeper mysteries within their literal meaning. For example, Isaiah 7, verse 14, Matthew 1, verse 23, was first spoken about the birth of King Hezekiah. Hosea 11, verse 1, Matthew 2, verse 15, was originally looking backwards to Israel's exodus from Egypt. Jeremiah 31, verse 15, Matthew 2, verse 18, describes the tragedy of the Jewish exile in 586 BC. And Matthew's reference to the Nazarene, Matthew 2, verse 23, is difficult to even locate. Thus, Matthew is not assembling the most obvious Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah and neatly attaching them to Jesus. His use of the Old Testament is legitimate and spiritual, but not artificial. That Matthew gathers obscure texts to interpret Jesus' infancy suggests that history is controlling his story, not the Old Testament. Matthew 1, verse 2 coheres with our knowledge of history with the extra-biblical sources. First, the Holy Family flight to Egypt, Matthew 2, verse 13, squares with known historical circumstances. Egypt at this time was the home of large Jewish colonies. Second, the role of the wise men in Matthew 2 corresponds with our knowledge of Persian sages from the ancient East. Their interest in astrology naturally linked them with stellar phenomena, i.e. the Star of Bethlehem. Third, the moral character of Herod the Great, known from other sources, is consistent with his actions in Matthew 2. Having murdered many suspected adversaries and even family members, it is reasonable to think that Herod would execute young Bethlehemites, Matthew 2, verse 16, as a preemptive strike against future threats to his crown. Of some relevance, the Pontifical Biblical Commission addressed the issue of historicity. In Matthew's infancy narrative at the turn of the 20th century, the commission was instituted by Pope Leo VIII to examine select biblical questions related to the Catholic faith. Though not infallible declaration of faith, the early decisions and decrees of this commission may be taken as authoritative guidance. After careful study of the issue weighing both ancient and modern interpretive traditions, the commission concluded on June 19, 1911, the contemporary challenges to the historical authenticity of Matthew 1 and 2 are devoid of solid foundation. In summary, Matthew's infancy narrative is both theological and historical. Matthew cites the Old Testament as confirmation of his stories, not as its foundation. He intends readers to view Jesus' early life as real events with real characters. For Matthew, Jesus himself holds the key to the Old Testament, and his coming marks a new era in salvation history that gathers up all of God's promises and brings them to fulfillment. The historical reliability of Matthew 1 through 2 then is consistent with Catholic tradition and the sound principles of biblical and historical study. And I just thought that was really kind of interesting how they came to that conclusion that in fact, because a lot of people question things in the Bible and things like that, so I think it's pretty interesting to find out how they came to the conclusion that in fact it was factual. So I just thought that was pretty interesting. I hope you found it interesting as well, and hope it helps with the rest of your study for Matthew. Have a good night, everybody. God bless.